Denis Pontonnier's excellent suite of plugins is now available for LightWave 2018 Plus, Mac and PC. So as a refresher, I thought I'd run through 3 simple uses of part move. A link to DP kit and chapter points can be found in the description below. As I hopefully remembered to say in the intro, let's start simply and stay that way. Create a box and let's create an array of 10 along the X. Boxes are loaded. We're going to create a new null and we're going to use that as our master moves object, if you like. So let's create a new null. Let's call it follow me. Our motion will start back here and we'll finish at the origin. So let's go 20 frames. Make sure modifier is on and Z. What I also might do is give our item a shape. On with the displacements, select our boxes, P for properties. Let's remove all of these just to save confusion. So all I need is the nodal displacement. First thing we need is an item info. Now we need DP kit's version of this. It has the magical time input here, which will become very useful later on. So to get the ball rolling, let's just literally double click on the item info, select and follow me, and plug that directly into the displacement. So now everything is following the move of that follow me master null. But that's not what we want. So let's get a part move node. Again, a DP kit essential. Let's take the position into the move and in the part move delta into the displacement. And what we'll see is, still nothing has changed. This is where the time input comes into action. Let's grab a procedural node. What I'm going to do is I'm going to feed the value in this case into time. And you'll see we've already got a random pattern. The nice thing about the procedural node is that we have a drop down of all the other procedural textures. So we just play around with one that makes you happy. If we go back to frame 0, you'll notice that it's not quite all lining up. This is where using the value input is quite nice. If we set the foreground to 0, it follows exactly. We want our delay to happen behind this movement, so we want a negative value. -1 will trail a second behind based on the procedural texture value. And as mentioned, if you don't like the result, vary it up. Our next example requires something a little more orderly. So to do this, we're going to go for the part info node. A quick note on the part info node is that it only works when the part move node is in the chain somewhere. We're also going to add a multiply node. So we're going to go from the index into the multiply, from the multiply into time. So similar to the previous example, if we put a minus number in here, we will see each part is trailing behind the movement of our master follow me null. If we put a smaller number in, the tighter the offset. In fact, with the follow me, let's make it a little bit quicker. That's great, but there is a downside to using the part index. Taking a look at our model we made earlier, we started with a base box at the origin. When we arrayed it, those boxes were created in a nice orderly part fashion. If I were to say, select this one, cut it and paste it back in, our part will now be out of sync. It'll go to this one and then it'll jump back to the one we've just pasted, that one. If we now go back into layout, we can see the result of that copying and pasting. Our part order is out of whack. So that's just one thing to be aware of. It's also worth mentioning that the part move node has a show ID button, which should help with any troubleshooting. What we need is a more robust way of getting the order. So how can we do that? Using a weight map would be a good option. If you have a copy of True Art's weight group polygons, then this is a great solution. But if you've got a massive complicated model, then this is probably not the way to go. In case you do, here's how it works. So we have a weight map with our weights on it. All we would do is swap out our part info node with a weight map node. A better option would be to use the X position of each of the parts. So that's quite simple. Vector scalar node, the original position of our boxes, and we want the X of each of those plugged into the multiply, finding a value that works for us. So with the tidying of the nulls, this is what we have based on the X position of each of the parts. As an added bonus, let's just add a little bit of animation to our master null. Okay, that's pretty good. So I've tidied that up a little bit. And all that remains to get that motion offset is to take the rotation and the scaling from our master null into the part move. Hit play, and we should have a nice little jumpy offset. For this next example, we're going to drive the displacement using an on-screen reference. Let's create a new null and call it move. This will be a linear type effect, so we'll start displaced on this side, and as we go through, the type will form behind it. We'll start by adding a little move on our displacement null, so we'll start it here. This is maximum displacement at frame 0, and let's move it to frame 30. Take it just a little bit further past the text. So with our text selected, go into nodal displacement. Let's reach for a part move node to begin with. In fact, we'll grab a part info while we're here as well. So the part move goes straight into the displacement. I'm going to randomize the position of each of these letters, I think. So I'm going to use, just to be different, a random vector node. I'm going to take the index of the part info and put that into our move. Okay, so I've just randomized the positions of each of those characters around a little bit based on these figures here. Whenever I'm doing these type of things, I like to think in terms of my start and end point. So what will be my start point and what will be my end? So in this case, this will be my start point. This will be my end point. So I'll quite simply have start point, end point, and I just need to transition between the two. We're going to get a vector scale node. Let's plug in the output of that into the vector and the result into the move, and we should get our full displacement. And what we're going to do is we're going to blend between this at 100% and no displacement at 0% based on the proximity of this move null. So this is what it looks like if it were blended all at once, which who knows may be exactly what you're after anyway. We're going to tie the null into this now, so let's get a gradient, an item info. LightWave's bog standard item info will be good for this, and let's point that to our move null, which is this one, and a subtract node. Make it the vector flavor version. Let's take the original part's position and subtract that against the position of the move null. Now we're going from left to right, or the x-axis here, so we'll need a vector scalar set to x to filter that out. Plug the output of that into our gradient. For the scale, we could use the alpha output of the gradient, but it's easier to visualize the colors. White will be 100% scale, black 0% scale. So let's hook the color output of the gradient into the scale. The first thing you saw is that the text jumped from displacement to no displacement. And this is because our gradient at our default position is at black, which is 0 displacement. So this is good to know. Our start position, as we mentioned earlier, we want to be fully displaced. So we're going to set that to white. And we're now back to our starting point. This gradient is now referencing this null. So at this point here, start at 0 is this point at 0 on the null. So everything plus that in this direction, we want maximum displacement. Let's move our timeline halfway. So what do we want? This is our 0 point, as we mentioned. Everything this side or positive of that, we want full displacement. So that is the same as that area. Everything behind that null, we want no displacement. So that is in fact negative. So to get that, we will go to our gradient. -5 will be plenty here based on our grid size of 2 meters. That's plenty. We'll add a keyframe to the minus, so sort of around this point, which will be, let's say, -2. Nothing happens because we're using the black and white values, white maximum, black 0. So if we change this value from white to black, we will get no displacement. So as we scrub the timeline, everything falls nicely into place. Obviously, the closer this key is to the 0 point, the tighter the offset. Further away, the softer the offset. But you'll have to remember to compensate for that additional space at the end. Also, it's worth noting that a nice addition to this piece, if we were to add a keyframe in the gradient somewhere here, and make that black, you see for no extra effort we've got a nice little dynamic overshoot. So play around with those values. You could also push the alpha value to get a further dip. This is the scene I made for the intro, and I used both previous examples I've shown you on this LightWave 3D text here. The first half of the animation is referencing this null here, going from right to left. It's exactly the same setup as before. I may have swapped around the subtracks purely because we're going in the opposite direction. The gradient, as before, going from black to white, and I've added an extra key in there, which adds to this little overshoot here. Let's unplug the scale. So the black and white in the gradient are our transitional values. I've split the transition into a couple of scale vector nodes. I'm using an angle node which is fed into the heading and bank, which can obviously be any value you want. But I'm also scaling from 0 to 1. Now if I was to use that directly, you'll see it's in the wrong order. So I've put a remap node in there. So we're remapping 0 to 1 to 1 to 0. So what that does is basically just reverse the black and white values. The second part of the animation is based on this rotation null here, which is just rotating 360 degrees. Exactly the same setup as our first example. So the thing to note here is you can use different controllers for different types of displacements and then easily add them together using the modifier stack. Final example, let's hopefully continue keeping things simple and create an array of boxes. Make sure the points haven't merged, so we've effectively got 512 individual boxes. Or parts. Create a null and call it move. We'll be using the distance between our move null and the center of each part. With this move reference, we're going to create a shape of a ball and we're going to make it scale, make it nice and big at 10 meters to begin with. The goal here is that everything outside of the circle will not be displaced, but everything within the circle will have maximum displacement. The setup is very similar to the previous example, but it's easy enough to set up. We'll remove what we don't need here and add a nodal displacement. Part move and part info. And as before, it's quite a nice effect, so let's go for another random. Now in this case, this will be our end position, if you like. That'll be our maximum displacement there. We're basically just going up and out a bit. While we're here, let's do something similar for the rotation. Make vector, and we're just going to rotate on the X and Y, or the heading and bank in this case. Let's get an angle node, and we'll vary it up between 90 and -90. I've inserted a sine node. If I have a positive 90, it will turn it into a minus, so I just need to change my angle once, and then hook that up to our rotation, and tweak accordingly, although it is a little bit difficult to tell at this stage. That's all tidied up a little bit. Let's bring in our reference null. LightWave's item info, point that to our reference, which is our move null. And this is where the slight variation is from the previous example. We want a distance node rather than a subtract. Now we want the distance between that null and each of those parts. And then we're going to plug that into a gradient. Let's get a couple of scale nodes. So we're taking the maths vector scale. We're going to be using the color output of our gradient, put that into the scale. Move output goes into our vector, and then we'll duplicate this scale node. The rotation into this vector and the color output of the gradient into the scale. Remembering to hook up this move node correctly. Finally, it's time to set up the gradient. If you remember, the move null has an item shape of 10 meters on it. 10 meters is the circumference, so what we need is a 5 meter radius. And we'll add a key right at the end. So this means at 5 meters and above, we'll have no displacement, but we want displacement within this circle here. On this key, move it just below 5 meters and make it white. Oh, and what do you see? We've got a nice displacement, all based around the center point of this null. Let's hook up the scale. Because it's going from black to white, which is basically 0 to 1, we can just take the color into the scale. Trouble is, you'll see it's reversed. So exactly the same to the previous example. Let's get a remap. Remap 0 to 1 to 1 to 0. Plug that into the scale. And as we're moving around, you can see our parts scale down to 0. As a final step, let's rig this so it's slightly more useful. Let's go to the item shape of our move null. And where it was 10 meters, put it 2 meters, so we get a radius of 1 meter from the gradient. Back in our box array, no displacement, open up the gradient. Strictly speaking, we don't need to do this, but it's good for reference. Put this last key at 1 meter. We now have a little displacement going on, but within a 1 meter range. Next thing is to show output for both of these keys. So we'll select this one, which is key 2, and we'll select this one, which is key 1. Now, somewhat annoyingly, you'll notice that this is in the wrong order, but what I found is a little hack. If you select it and delete it, and then undo, it comes back in the correct order. So this is key 1, this is key 2. Key 2 is at our 1 meter position. And give that a little nudge. Next step is to take the scaling from our move null into position 2. Not much will happen until, that is, you start scaling. So from nothing to a nice big offset based on the position of that null. So that's lovely, but what about the fall off in the middle? You could quite easily create another null and parent it to this move null and use the scaling from that, so you've got 2 on-screen controls. But for simplicity here, we're going to add a subtract node, take the scaling from that, we'll give this a setting of 4, so that scale -4, and we'll feed that into this key 1 position here. Now you may get some strange results if your subtracted value takes the scaling into the minus. But there is a way around that, and that's to use the clamp node. We'll take that out of there and into the position. We want a low number in here, not quite 0. The high value could be just a massive number, but we know it's not going to go above this value, so we might as well clamp it with that value there. A possible downside to using the distance is you get to a certain point and it starts to reform. So make sure when you're scaling that you cover the full object to stop this from happening. This is a fantastically versatile setup. To show what I mean, I've loaded up some stairs. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take that nodal displacement from the box array. I'm going to copy that. And onto the stairs, which I've deleted all the modifiers, is simply paste it onto that. Let's hide the boxes. We'll displace my staircase. If you wanted an architectural type animation where it built from nothing to a fully formed piece, then going into the gradient and swapping the colors around should give you exactly what you need. Making sure that the scaling value covers the full object. I'm using a random vector here, but obviously you could try morphs, attach it to other items, particles even, whatever gets your message across. And also let's not forget, in the part move, play around with the settings. The pivot point is quite a handy one. If it's not quite doing what you want it to do, you can base that pivot on whereabouts within the part it is based. Yeah, so that was pretty straightforward. You got some complex animation for not much effort at all. Perhaps open up an old model and apply it and see what happens. Many thanks to Denis for his fabulous suite of plugins and making them free to the LightWave people. A link for them is in the description below. Perhaps chuck him a few quid as well.